And here we are again, doing another devlog. This is going to be a bit of an interesting week, because this is the first week since I started working on the platformer project that I haven't actually worked on the platformer project. And that is because, as I said last week, I've been working on a game jam game over the past week, and I will still be doing that over the next week or so. So there will probably not be a lot of progress on the platforming game until after the 22nd. I expect next week to also not be too much about that. That being said, I did do some things for the game. I didn't do anything in engine. That's not true, actually. I did technically do a thing. Literally one thing, well, two things. Let's get into it. I made a enemy for the walking, a model for the walking enemy. I made the dragon last week for the flying enemy that goes up and down. I did also slap a quick texture on that one. Just a pre-made material for like dragon scales that I found in Substance Painter, which I'll talk about more in a moment, actually. And I also just put a quick leather texture on the enemy that I made this week, just again to have it more than just be a solid color. And you can see the enemy that I made. It's a really weird creature. Again, texturing is going to be redone for both of these eventually. These are very much just temporary to have them have a bit of a look to them. But it's a bit of a combination between an ant and a spider. Not necessarily a spider in that it has 8 legs. It has 6 legs. It has the body of an ant, more or less. The way its legs move are kind of a mixture between how ants walk and how spiders walk. Looking up reference for that was very, very interesting, because again, I am not necessarily much of an animator, right? I've said this before. So looking up references of how these things walk and how to make the walk cycle for them has been very enlightening, and I do feel like I've actually gained quite a lot of skill in animation throughout the process of literally just moving these 6 legs. It was a very easy thing to do. I didn't expect it to be this easy. The way it works is the legs work in sync diagonally, so I could just parent one leg to a leg that diagonal from it and just animate only one side. The other side animates automatically with it. And last week, 2 weeks ago, I came across a tutorial on YouTube about making organic walk cycles in Blender, using things like setting a bone on a path, for instance. And that's exactly what I use here. So what I did is I made a circle, I flattened the bottom of the circle, and I made one of the bones just follow that circle based on an offset value. And that makes for such easier and also better looking animation than manually putting the legs where you want them. Those kind of tricks and like working with these constraints that Blender gives you is something that I haven't really done much of before, and that's probably why I felt like I was a very, very bad animator. Also, just like the organic movement of things, I am not great at replicating that yet. Maybe that's a yet, but I'm not great at replicating that. But also, I feel like I haven't been using all the tools that are available to me and all the techniques that I could be using to get better looking results. And we'll get into that with modeling in a moment as well, because I do feel like I have actually increased my skills in a lot of fields in this last week by a fair amount. Because as I said, the animation based on constraints was a very, very big eye-opener, and I feel like this is actually going to help me now that I know this is a usable technique, and I know that it works with circles and you can manipulate the shape of the circles, but it works with really any kind of shape. As long as you can make a path, you can make a bone follow it and drive that for a animation. Combine that with inverse kinematics on the actual armature, and you can suddenly just move an arm around very easily on a path. To the example that I gave, I think last week, is making a robotic arm move like this. It's very, very easy. Making a more natural looking hand wave like that, it's still going to be very complicated, but being able to just make a path to have the hand go across and just animate the progression there, that will make something like that a lot easier as well. Upper arm and lower arm and upper arm movements, those are just then all done through inverse kinematics, which if this is all very confusing to a lot of people, the thing is, right, with these devlogs, I never know how much detail I need to go into with explanations. because these aren't necessarily tutorials. These are meant to just give an insight into what I'm doing, and I am assuming you have at least like a basic rough knowledge of these kind of things. But I'll go very quickly into it. The way you animate 3D models, obviously, as you've seen me do many times now, or at least a couple of times, is with bones. And these bones, you can change their location and their rotation, but they all work individually. And if I have a bone on, I don't know if you can see this, a bone on my upper arm and a bone on my lower arm, like a bone for the hand, and then like 2 or 3 bones for each finger if you want to have very, very detailed animation. But if I like move this bone, these bones are parented to it usually, so they will move with it. And then if I move this bone, everything under that will also move with it. But not in a natural way, because if I want to move like my hand, right? Because that's usually the thing you want to focus on is like hand or feet movement for making like walk cycles or any kind of action. If I just move the hand, nothing else moves, because it only moves with forward kinematics, as it's called. It only moves things in the hierarchy that are under it. With inverse kinematics, it also then reverses that animation with the inverse direction. Meaning that you can just move the hand around and the arm will just follow suit. And it's a little bit more complicated than that. It has, you have like a pole target to know where the elbow, for instance, is pointing, all that kind of stuff. But it really makes natural animation a lot easier to do. Those kind of things I'm still grasping, I'm learning. Inverse kinematics for very basic things like arms and legs are easy, but for like things like the wings I had to make on the dragon, it was a little bit more tricky, because then you suddenly have to use a technique that you have taken from a tutorial, but apply it to a separate instance for something you want to make, which might not have an exact tutorial, right? And I've said this before, I don't know if it's been in these videos, but I've said this before, at least in like Let's Play videos and just in conversations in general, is I think the mark of professionalism is being able to take information from one context and apply it in a different context. And I'm starting to get there with certain parts of this 3D animation thing. Doesn't mean that I'm a professional animator by any sense, but it does mean that allows for very quick and very explosive growth, I think, in your skill set. Because at that point, if you understand what a technique does and can apply it into a different context, it's not a matter of getting better, it's just a matter, well, it is still a matter of getting better, but it's mostly a matter of just learning a lot of different kinds of techniques to apply to all kinds of situations, and then you can make whatever you want, right? So I've been growing a lot in that regard. That has been everything I did for the 3D platformer. So if that's all you're interested in, thanks for watching. If you're watching for a more general overview of what I've been doing, the Game Jam game. I haven't programmed anything for it. As a matter of fact, I haven't touched any programming in like a week and a half. But I've been 3D modeling and animating, mostly modeling, really, for this. And the task that I gave myself for this is I do not want to use pre-made textures. That's my challenge here. I want to make the textures myself. And so far, that's actually been going very, very well. I didn't know if I was going to be able to do this. So I started off the week making a shark. And that was relatively easy. It's also like, it's very basic material. But I, again, feel like I've grown a lot there, been a lot more professional. I've manually UV Unwrapped, which again, if you don't know what that is, if you have a 3D model like this thing right here, that's actually a very bad example. To put a texture on this, you need to make this into a two-dimensional plane, because textures are two-dimensional. They're just images. So what you do is you like put a seam here, and you put a seam like over all these corners, and then you can unwrap it as you would do with a cube, but with a more complicated thing. And sometimes it doesn't all fit in one thing, and you need to cut it up into different parts, which are called islands. Before this, and I'm sure I will do it a lot in the future too, I mostly just like right-clicked automatic UV unwrap in Blender, and it does a not horrible job. It doesn't do a great job, but it doesn't do a horrible job, generally speaking, of it. And it makes sure that it minimizes stretching, which is very important, because if you don't do proper UV unwrapping, your texture might be stretched over certain parts of your model, and that is why it's very important to do that, and not just have it done automatically in general. So I've been practicing a lot with that. I've learned a lot of techniques in that regard, like doing it live, and just bit by bit seeing, okay, so that part of the texture is still stretched, maybe I can put a seam here, and so on and so forth. So I did that mostly for another model that I made, which I'll talk about a little bit later. I also did the texturing, all manually, and I learned some techniques about making I don't know what the official name of it is. I personally call it a blending texture, which is just an image file that says this part of the texture, use this shader that I've made, or this image. This part of the model, use this. This part of the model, do this. And it's just driven by a red channel, a blue channel, and a green channel. So you can do, in one image, have 4 materials mixed all together. And if you need more, you just make a second image and you have 4 new ones. Or 3 new ones, really. So that is more or less how I ended up going with all the models that I've made. So the shark was very easy because I just made a texture that was for the top, where at the head it was a lot more fine detail. At the tail, the details became a little less fine, because that's apparently how sharks generally look. I just all based on images I could find on Google Images. And then I needed a more white, but not pure white, because that would be a little weird for the bottom. And then use that technique that I just mentioned to mix between the materials, and baked everything out as texture, so I could send it off to the person putting it all together in Unreal Engine. Because again, I'm not working within Unreal for this project, at least so far. Maybe next week I'll do a little bit if it ends up being necessary, but I don't see it as being likely, because I still have a lot of 3D models that I need to work on, and I don't have a huge amount of time for this, sadly. So how far are we into the recording? Only 15 minutes. I can keep talking for a little while longer. Okay, because before, what I did was I just made multiple materials and said, okay, these parts of the model have this material, these parts of the model have this material, and while that is not horrible, I guess, it's very poorly optimized, because having multiple materials is apparently slightly more heavy for the calculations that your computer has to do, which makes sense. So putting it all together in just like one texture map, there's a reason pretty much all modern games do that. And that is because, well, there's 2 reasons. Number 1 is because you have texture artists that are not game designers. So they just give something to the game designers that they can use, right? Because that's how larger teams work. You need to have an output format. But the other side is it is just more efficient to just use an image. It takes up a little bit of RAM, yeah, true, but it is less calculation, because you have to realize that baking this texture, it takes a moment to like put all this information for the texture that I made and make it into an image. If you're doing that live in a game, instead of just reading that image, it has to make that image first and then read it, which just takes more calculation power. I don't know how much more, but it takes more. And it's, again, as long as you don't go overboard and make everything a 4K texture, which at that point you'll start running into serious memory issues, specifically video memory issues, it'll be more efficient. So that's a thing that I learned this week, and that I will be using a lot going forward. So I also learned a lot about like the sculpting. Okay, so what I was talking about, materials. Another upside to making everything within a texture is that you can have gradients between one material and the other. Because if you just say these faces or these polygons have this material and these polygons have that material, you're going to have a very sharp seam line. And even things like just natural things, just things out in the world, let's say this can of Coke, which is on my desk, it seems like the material here is a very, and this actually, okay, other side is a better idea. This is a very sharp line. I mean, you can't really see. A very sharp line from the red aluminum painted aluminum to just the aluminum, right? It's probably better in 99% of cases if there is a slight amount of gradient between those textures, because nothing in the real world is 100% sharp, and it just doesn't feel right to see a 100% sharp line in most cases. Some cases, yes, there will be. I think this Coke can is actually a very bad example, because this is one of the examples where I'm like, yeah, no, that's a pretty goddamn sharp line. But going into, like, do I have an example? I have a very messy desk, so surely I have something over here. Well, anyway, even on the shark itself, right, there's some lines that you would think, okay, you want to have that sharp, but just having that with a little bit of a gradual change in the texture makes it feel better. And that's not to say that the texture for this shark is amazing, because it certainly isn't, but it's the first model that I've made 100% from nothing. Like, when I started, there was nothing, and when I finished, there was a shark, and I used no other resources than what I made myself. And that is quite a milestone, honestly, I think. Not using, and it doesn't mean that you can't ever use resources from somewhere else, because in the end, I am working in Blender, which is a resource that's made, a software that's made by someone else. And then I import those models into Unreal, which is an engine, which is made as a resource by someone else, right? So I'm not going to program my own software just to do everything myself. So to a certain extent, you want to use other people's resources, but you also want to be able to, everything that's like the artistic parts, you want to have at least a basic grasp on how to do. If not to make everything yourself, at least to take things other people have made and manipulated into what you want it to be. So making that shark absolutely from scratch was a very important moment. So I then also modeled a little like time bomb. The idea for the game is that you're trying to dismantle bombs. I'm not going to talk too much about the actual game itself, because unlike the 3D platformer, which will be months and months, and I don't know how long before it's actually like in a releasable state, this will just be publicly available before the end of the month. So you can wait a little bit in ambiguity until then to play it. But you're dismantling bombs is the idea of the game. So I had to make the bomb again. I manually UV Unwrapped it. I made the textures. I blended the textures. That went over fairly easily, really. There's not much to say about that. Then, the last thing I made, which I finished only last night as of recording this, and that's actually the same day that I'm uploading it, because I've been so busy I haven't had time to record this video earlier, is a little drone thing. And this one I am actually very, very happy with. It's a very basic, like spaceship, fighter jet type looking thing. It's a bit of a mix between a TIE fighter and an X-Wing from Star Wars, both. I started off with the idea of making it a mix between like a normal actual jet and a X-Wing. But when I started working on it, I got the idea of, well, if I'm using the X-Wing as inspiration, it'd be fun to just make it look a bit more like a TIE fighter as well. So it's kind of like you can see it on screen, right? It's kind of like the little person thing where you sit in the TIE fighter and then have the wings from the X-Wing, which doesn't make any sense because it's supposed to be a drone, so it doesn't have to have a seating area. But that's just where the camera goes for the drone, right? That's how that works, I guess. It doesn't really matter, I suppose. And for this, I also made all of the materials myself. The UV unwrapping by itself took like 45 minutes because while it's a fairly simple spaceship, it still is a fairly complicated shape. Unlike things where I can just decide like, okay, I'm going to the shark, right? I'm going to cut the fin off and that's going to be its own island and just cut that open to like spread it because you need to have a seam going along the fin. I'll just do that for all the fins individually. I'll have a seam going like on the bottom of the body. I think it is on the bottom, it might be on the top. I hope it's on the bottom. Would make more sense on the bottom, I think. That is a more free-form way. I feel like with these organic kind of things, it has a lot more room for error. Also because those models are a lot higher in polygon count, I'll admit. The drone I made is actually fairly low poly, I think, all things considered. But UV unwrapping that was a lot more difficult because it has a lot more hard edges, and those hard edges are going to be a lot more difficult to work with, at least in my experience, which is very, very little experience, but the experience I've had so far, that was a lot more difficult to work with. So UV unwrapping that by itself took like 45 minutes after I finished modeling it. The entire recording is like almost 2 hours for like modeling and UV unwrapping it. And then I spent another like 2.5 hours doing the texturing for it. So the entire model, and one little animation, but that took like next to no time. The entire model from start to finish, again, with no outside resources, took me like 6 or 7 hours to make probably. And I'm very, very happy with it. It's definitely the most complicated model that I've made in terms of, maybe not in terms of shape, well, maybe still in terms of shape actually. As far as like rigid objects go, like organic objects, I've made more complicated things. Like the dragon, you could argue, is more complicated. But as far as like hard surface objects go, I think this is the most complicated thing I've made. Together with the fact that the material for this is probably like the node tree. I'll show you. I haven't done a recording of that because I forgot. But I'll just show you either a screenshot or me just going over it real quickly. The node tree for this material is more complicated than like 90% of the programming I've done for my own game so far, which is also done on Node, so that's why I compared it to. And I'm very, very happy with it, because it's a mix between like 7 different shaders or something like that. I think it's pretty good for being like one of my first 5, well, not one of my first 5 models, but it's definitely, it's my 3rd texture I've ever made, right? And it's fairly complicated. So that's all the things that I've done this week. It's been a lot of modeling, it's been a lot of texturing, which I want to talk about that one thing quickly, because I had a subscription to Substance Painter, partly because it comes with a lot of pre-existing materials, smart materials as well, which is very, very nice. That can automatically detect like edges and like make wear and tear on those edges using those materials, like streaks and stuff like that, mostly in flat areas, not as much on creases and stuff like that. Those smart materials are amazing, but I don't want to end up using just those pre-made materials most of the time for the final product of my game. So what I decided to do is cancel my subscription to that. I wanted to keep Substance Designer though. I haven't worked in Substance Designer yet. So far I've done all my making of materials inside Blender. I've read, heard and seen Substance Designer is a lot more versatile and an industry standard for a reason. So I wanted to take that, but I had a personal Adobe subscription to the 3D pack, right? Because that's like it's 16 euros a month or something like that. It's not that expensive. But I was very annoyed I had to log in and out from personal to business account every single time I wanted to switch between opening Adobe Premiere and Adobe Substance Painter. So I figured, okay, let's just bring that over to my business account. Turns out it's a lot more expensive if you want to do it on your business account, because you have to take the entire 3D suite or just one piece of software. One piece of software is 30 bucks, which is twice as expensive as I was paying before. The entire suite is 70 a month, and I only want to use Substance Designer. So I decided, fuck that, because I don't want to really use Substance Painter anymore anyway. I'm probably going to do most of that in Blender. I might look into Quixel Mixer as well for that piece of the workflow, but largely I'll probably just do it in Blender. And Substance Designer itself, I figured out, is actually available on Steam for purchase rather than for rental, and it's 150 euros, which means that I can either keep doing what I'm doing and within a year it'll be cheaper for me to have bought it. I can transition to the business account for Adobe, and within 3 months it'll be cheaper for me to have bought it. Or I can just buy it and I won't get any updates. I won't get the 2022 version, but somehow I kind of feel like that's not gonna matter too much. And even if it does, having to spend like 150 bucks every year, maybe every like 3 years, because you don't need to upgrade every year probably, isn't that much in the whole scheme of things. So I'm not going to get it right now, because right now I'm too busy with other things. I am on a game jam schedule for this game, for these models. So I don't have time to start learning a new piece of software. Then when we actually get back to making my game, it's going to be very much temporary assets and stuff like that. So it's probably going to be a couple of months, but I'm going to buy the license on Steam for Substance Designer. Might be the 2022 version by then anyway. So that's something that I wanted to talk about a little bit as well. But I do think that I need to finish up this video right now because my camera is going to shut off otherwise. So I'll see you back next week with more talk about this Game Jam game and probably more talk about materials and 3D modeling. After that, we'll be back with my own game and we'll be talking a bit about particle systems because that's the next thing I need to do for my own game is design some particle systems. I'll see you back then.